Tonight's story is about a flag, a folded letter, and a man who'd already fought enough battles to know which ones truly matter. When a suburban rulebook tried to outrank 20 years of service, it wasn't rage that answered, but principle, patience, and a quiet sense of duty. This isn't a story about yelling or revenge. It's about drawing a line with facts, standing firm with history, and watching a community remember what respect really means. If calm, thoughtful storytelling helps you find meaning in the quiet stand people take for what's right, feel free to subscribe. There's always another story just beneath the surface. And before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what the flag means to you. I stared at the letter in my hands, reading it for the third time to make sure I wasn't missing something. The HOA letterhead looked official enough, complete with our neighborhood's little logo of a tree and some houses. Linda Thompson's signature sat at the bottom in neat cursive, right below her title, President Meadowbrook Community Association. Section 8, Article 3, Unauthorized Exterior Modifications. I read the words out loud to my empty kitchen, and they sounded even more ridiculous than they looked on paper. The fine amount was printed in bold, $100. Below that, a paragraph about escalating legal action if I didn't remove my flag within 7 business days. My first reaction was to laugh. I actually did laugh, a short bark that echoed off my kitchen cabinets. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe Linda had mixed up addresses, or someone was playing an elaborate prank. I walked back to my front door and looked out at my flag, hanging exactly where I'd mounted it every Memorial Day for the past 6 years. The red, white, and blue fabric moved slightly in the afternoon breeze. Nothing fancy about the setup, just a simple bracket I'd screwed into the porch column and a standard 3x5 flag, the same flag I'd flown at every house I'd lived in since retiring from the Army. The same flag that had draped over too many coffins of friends who didn't make it home. I went back inside and read the letter again. This time, the humor faded completely. 20 years I'd served this country. 3 tours overseas, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. I'd been shot at, mortared, and had watched good soldiers die for the principles that flag represented. I'd folded that flag over the caskets of men and women who'd never see another Memorial Day, and now some suburban HOA president was telling me I needed permission to honor them. The insult hit deeper than I'd expected. My jaw tightened as I set the letter down on my kitchen counter. Linda Thompson had probably never spent a day in uniform, never heard incoming fire, never had to write a letter to someone's parents explaining why their kid wasn't coming home. Yet here she was, lecturing me about proper procedures for displaying the American flag. I could feel my temper rising, that familiar heat that used to get me in trouble as a young soldier. But 20 years in the Army had taught me better than to react on emotion. Master sergeants don't throw tantrums. They gather intelligence, assess the situation, and then execute a plan. I grabbed my laptop from the living room and set it up on the kitchen table. If Linda Thompson wanted to play games with regulations, she'd picked the wrong veteran. I'd spent 2 decades navigating military bureaucracy, and I knew how to research rules and regulations better than most lawyers. The first search was simple: HOA, American Flag, Federal Law. The results filled my screen immediately. Page after page of legal precedents, federal statutes, and court cases. I clicked on the first official-looking link and started reading. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005. I'd never heard of it before, but the title alone made me sit up straighter. The law was clear and direct, written in language that left no room for interpretation. Federal law prohibited homeowners associations from restricting the display of the American flag, with specific protections for respectful displays on residential property. I kept reading, taking notes on a pad I'd grabbed from my junk drawer. The law covered flagpoles, brackets, and reasonable display methods. It superseded any HOA covenant or local ordinance. Most importantly, it included penalties for associations that violated the federal statute. My smile started small and grew wider as I read through case after case of HOAs getting slapped down by federal courts. Associations in Texas, Florida, California, all forced to pay damages and legal fees after trying to restrict flag displays. Some had been hit with civil rights violations. Others faced federal investigations. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Linda's letter again. Her neat signature suddenly looked a lot less intimidating. In fact, it looked like evidence. The research took me 3 hours. By the time I closed my laptop, I had a folder full of printed articles, legal precedents, and contact information for organizations that specialized in these exact cases. The American Legion had a whole legal department dedicated to flag display rights. The VFW offered free legal assistance for veterans facing HOA harassment. Even the State Attorney General's office had a civil rights division that handled these complaints. I walked back out to my porch and looked at my flag again. The evening air was still, and the fabric hung straight down from the pole. 3 folded flags sat in my bedroom closet upstairs, one from my retirement ceremony, and 2 that had been given to me by families who wanted their loved one's battle buddy to have them. Those flags would never fly again, but this one would keep flying as long as I drew breath. Linda Thompson had made a serious mistake. She'd picked a fight with someone who knew how to fight back, and she'd chosen the worst possible battlefield. You don't mess with a veteran's right to honor his fallen brothers and sisters. Not on Memorial Day. Not ever. I folded the HOA letter and slipped it into the folder with my research. Tomorrow morning, I'd start making some phone calls. But tonight, I just stood on my porch and watched my flag in the fading daylight, thinking about the friends who'd never get to see another sunset. For the first time since finding that letter taped to my door, I was smiling. I woke up with the federal statute still fresh in my mind. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005. Even the name had a nice ring to it. I'd printed out the key sections before going to bed, and they sat on my kitchen counter next to Linda Thompson's ridiculous letter like a legal 1-2 punch. Coffee first, then warfare. That had been my rule overseas, and it served me well in civilian life too. I filled my mug with the dark roast I'd been drinking since my first deployment and sat down at my laptop. The cursor blinked in the empty email field, waiting for me to craft my response. I started typing Linda's email address, which I'd found on the HOA website, along with her cheerful bio about maintaining community standards and preserving property values. Her profile picture showed a woman with perfectly styled hair and a smile that probably worked great at neighborhood barbecues. Too bad she'd picked the wrong fight. The subject line came easily. Reviolation notice. Federal law clarification. Professional, direct, and just formal enough to let her know this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. I kept my tone respectful but firm as I laid out the facts. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 explicitly prohibited homeowners associations from restricting the display of the American flag on residential property. Federal law superseded any HOA covenant, community guideline, or local ordinance. The display had to be respectful, which mine clearly was, and it had to be on the homeowner's property, which it obviously was. Then I added the details that would make her pay attention. My current work as a civilian contractor with the Department of Defense wasn't classified information, and it established that I wasn't just some angry retiree with too much time on his hands. I mentioned my connections with the local VFW chapter where I served on the Veterans Rights Committee. I also noted that I'd already reached out to contacts in the State Attorney General's office who specialized in civil rights violations, just to make sure I understood my options. I wasn't threatening her, just making it clear that I knew exactly who to call if this escalated. The difference mattered both legally and tactically. The closing paragraph was my favorite part. I thanked her for bringing this matter to my attention, since it had helped me learn about an important federal law that protected all veterans' rights. I expressed my hope that the HOA would want to comply with federal statutes and avoid any potential legal complications. Then I signed it with my full name and rank, just to drive the point home. I read through the email twice, checking for any language that might sound aggressive or unprofessional. Military communication had taught me that the most effective messages were often the calmest ones. Let the facts do the intimidating. The send button felt satisfying to click. I didn't expect a quick response. In my experience, bureaucrats needed time to panic, make phone calls, and figure out how badly they'd screwed up. I figured I'd hear back sometime this afternoon, probably with some kind of form letter about reviewing my concerns. I was wrong. My phone chimed with a new email notification at 10:47 a.m., less than 2 hours after I'd hit send. The subject line made me raise an eyebrows. Immediate resolution. Thank you for your service. Linda Thompson's reply was a complete 180 from her original violation notice. The professional HOA president tone had been replaced by something that sounded almost frantic. She opened with an apology for the misunderstanding and claimed the violation letter had been sent in error. Apparently, there had been some kind of miscommunication within the HOA board about flag display policies. The backpedaling got better from there. The Meadowbrook Community Association fully supported our veterans and had immediately rescinded the fine. She wanted to make it clear that my flag display was completely appropriate and welcomed by the community. She even thanked me for my service and mentioned that her own father had served in Vietnam. I leaned back in my chair and read the email again. The transformation was impressive, if not particularly surprising. I'd seen the same thing happen to drill sergeants who'd overstepped their authority and suddenly found themselves explaining their actions to a colonel. Amazing how quickly people could discover their inner patriot when federal law got involved. But something about the whole response bothered me. The speed of it, for one thing. Linda had gone from threatening legal action to complete capitulation in less than 2 hours. That suggested she'd either known about the federal law all along, or she'd made some very quick phone calls to people who did. Either way, it meant this wasn't really an error or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move that had backfired spectacularly. I closed my laptop and walked out to my porch. My flag hung exactly where it had been yesterday, completely unchanged except for Linda Thompson's sudden appreciation for it. The morning air was warming up, and I could hear a lawnmower running somewhere down the street. Normal suburban sounds on a normal Tuesday morning. Except now I was wondering how many other neighbors had gotten similar letters over the years. How many people had just paid the fine rather than fight it? How many veterans had been bullied into taking down their flags because they didn't know about federal protections? The thought made my jaw tighten again. Getting my own fine dropped was a good start, but it didn't solve the bigger problem. Linda Thompson and her HOA board were still out there, still looking for violations to cite and fines to collect. They'd just learned to avoid messing with federal law, but that left plenty of other ways to harass people. I went back inside and pulled up the HOA website on my laptop. The meeting schedule was posted under a tab labeled Community Involvement. Regular board meetings happened the first Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. in the community center. Public comment period started at 7:30. This Thursday was 3 days away. I'd spent enough time in briefing rooms to know that private conversations and email exchanges only went so far. Sometimes you needed to stand up in front of everyone and make your point where it couldn't be ignored or explained away later. Sometimes you needed to make sure the message reached more people than just the person who'd made the mistake. Linda Thompson had apologized to me, but she hadn't apologized to the community. She hadn't explained how this error had happened or what she was doing to prevent it from happening again. Most importantly, she hadn't changed any policies to protect other residents from the same harassment. I bookmarked the meeting page and started thinking about what I wanted to say on Thursday night. 3 days would give me time to prepare properly, maybe reach out to a few neighbors and see if anyone else had stories to share. My phone buzzed with a text message from my buddy Mike at the VFW. He'd heard through the grapevine that I was having HOA trouble and wanted to know if I needed backup. Word traveled fast in veteran circles, especially when it involved flag rights. I texted him back about Thursday's meeting and suggested he might want to attend. Mike had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had even less patience for bureaucratic nonsense than I did. Having him there would send a message about community support. By noon, I had 3 more texts from other veterans in the neighborhood. Apparently, Mike had been busy spreading the word. None of them had been cited for flag violations, but all of them had stories about ridiculous HOA fines and overreach, pool furniture violations, mailbox height requirements, unauthorized garden decorations, the usual suburban power trip stuff. I spent the afternoon making a list of talking points for Thursday's meeting. Linda Thompson might think this was over, but she was about to learn the difference between a tactical retreat and a strategic victory. I pulled my dress uniform from the closet Thursday evening, running my hands over the fabric to smooth out any wrinkles. The dark blue jacket still fit perfectly, and the ribbons and badges caught the bedroom light as I laid everything out on my bed. I hadn't worn this uniform since my retirement ceremony 3 years ago, but tonight felt like the right occasion for it. The community center parking lot was fuller than I'd expected when I arrived at 6:45. Cars lined both sides of the street, and I could see people walking toward the building in small groups. Word had definitely gotten around about tonight's meeting. I straightened my tie one last time in the rearview mirror, then stepped out into the evening air. The moment I walked through the front doors, conversations stopped, heads turned, and I could feel eyes tracking my movement across the room. The dress uniform had exactly the effect I'd hoped for. This wasn't just another angry neighbor showing up to complain about his water bill. This was a veteran making a statement. I found a seat in the third row, close enough to be seen but far enough back to observe the board's reactions. Linda Thompson sat at the head table with 4 other board members, shuffling through papers and avoiding eye contact with anyone in the audience. She looked smaller than I'd imagined from her website photo, and definitely less confident than her violation letter had suggested. The other board members kept glancing in my direction, then whispering to each other behind their hands. One older man in a polo shirt looked particularly nervous, tapping his pen against his notepad in a rapid rhythm that echoed through the room. A woman with short gray hair kept checking her watch as if she hoped the meeting might somehow end before it started. Mike showed up right at 7, wearing his VFW cap and a serious expression that I recognized from our deployment days. He nodded at me and took a seat 2 rows back, close enough to provide backup if needed, but far enough away to avoid looking like we'd coordinated our arrival. 3 other veterans I knew from the neighborhood had also shown up, scattered throughout the room in what looked like casual seating but felt more like tactical positioning. Linda called the meeting to order with a voice that cracked slightly on the first few words. She cleared her throat and tried again, working through the standard agenda items with mechanical precision: budget reports, landscaping updates, pool maintenance schedules, the usual suburban bureaucracy that somehow required monthly meetings to discuss. I listened with half my attention while studying the board members' body language. Linda kept glancing at me during her reports, losing her place in her notes each time our eyes met. The nervous man with the pen had progressed from tapping to full-blown fidgeting, adjusting his collar and wiping his forehead despite the air conditioning. The gray-haired woman had given up on her watch and was now staring at her hands folded in her lap. They knew why I was here. More importantly, they knew they'd screwed up. The public comment period opened at 7:30 sharp. Linda announced it with obvious reluctance, explaining the 3-minute time limit and asking speakers to state their names for the record. Her voice had steadied somewhat, but I could see her hands trembling as she shuffled her papers. I stood up slowly, letting the movement draw attention before I spoke. The room went completely quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and someone's nervous cough from the back row. "David Mitchell, 1247 Oak Street," I said, my voice carrying easily to the back of the room. 20-year Army veteran, retired Master Sergeant. I pulled out the printed copy of the federal statute I'd brought with me, unfolding it deliberately while the board members watched. Linda's face had gone pale, and the fidgeting man had stopped moving entirely. "I want to read something to everyone here tonight. This is from the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005, United States Code Title 4, Section 5. I held the paper up so the audience could see the official formatting, then began reading in the same clear tone I'd used for military briefings. No condominium association, cooperative association, or residential real estate management association may adopt or enforce any policy or enter into any agreement that would restrict or prevent a member of the association from displaying the flag of the United States on residential property within the association with respect to which such member has a separate ownership interest." I paused to let that sink in, looking around the room at faces that ranged from confused to angry to satisfied. Several people were nodding, and I could see a few residents pulling out their phones to take notes or record what I was saying. This past Monday, Memorial Day, I received a violation notice from this HOA board. They fined me $100 for displaying an American flag on my own property without proper authorization. My voice hardened slightly on the last 2 words. They threatened escalating legal action if I didn't remove that flag within 7 business days. The murmur that went through the room sounded like anger building. I could see neighbors turning to look at the board table where Linda was now staring at her hands, and the other members looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. I find it disgraceful and tone-deaf that any American community organization would threaten a veteran on Memorial Day for honoring the flag that represents everything we fought to defend. I didn't serve 20 years in the United States Army, including 3 combat tours overseas, so someone with a clipboard could tell me where I'm allowed to honor my country and my fallen brothers and sisters. The silence that followed felt heavy and complete. Then someone in the back row started clapping. The sound spread quickly through the room until most of the audience was applauding, some people standing up as they clapped. I remained at attention until the applause died down, then folded my paper and sat back down. Linda tried to interrupt before the next speaker could stand up. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to apologize again for that misunderstanding. As I explained in my email, that notice was sent in error, and we've already—" "Ma'am," I said without standing up, "I had my 3 minutes. Other people are waiting to speak." The rebuke was gentle but firm, and it shut her down immediately. She nodded quickly and called for the next speaker. But the damage was already done. The room's energy had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. What followed was better than I'd hoped for. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their own stories of HOA overreach. A woman from Maple Street had been fined for planting roses in her front yard without approval. An elderly man had received a violation for parking his classic car in his own driveway because it was supposedly a commercial vehicle. A young couple had been cited for having the wrong color mailbox, even though it matched the one that had been there when they bought the house. Each story built on the last one, creating a picture of an HOA board that had lost sight of its actual purpose. The nervous man with the pen had started sweating visibly, and the gray-haired woman looked like she was reconsidering her life choices. Linda kept trying to interject with explanations and apologies, but the speakers weren't interested in hearing from her. The meeting devolved into exactly what I'd hoped it would become: a heated discussion about the board's priorities and methods. Multiple residents demanded changes to the community guidelines. Others questioned why the board was spending time and money harassing neighbors instead of addressing real maintenance issues. Someone pointed out that the pool had been broken for 2 months while the HOA focused on mailbox violations. Linda and the other board members promised to review all policies related to patriotic displays, then expanded that to reviewing all enforcement policies in general. They talked about forming committees and holding special sessions and bringing in outside consultants, the usual bureaucratic response to getting caught doing something stupid. I listened to their promises with the skepticism of someone who'd heard similar commitments from military leadership over the years. Some of them might be sincere, but institutional change required more than good intentions. It required sustained pressure and accountability. By 9 o'clock, the board had promised to review everything, apologize to everyone, and basically start over with their entire approach to community management. The audience was finally satisfied enough to let the meeting end, though several small groups continued their conversations in the parking lot. Mike caught up with me as I walked to my car. "That went better than expected," he said, grinning. "You see Linda's face when you started reading that federal law?" "Hard to miss," I replied. "Question is whether they'll actually follow through on any of those promises." "Guess we'll find out next month," Mike said. "I'm thinking a few of us should make these meetings a regular habit. Keep them honest." I nodded, unlocking my car door. The evening had gone exactly as I'd planned, maybe even better. The board had been publicly embarrassed. The community had heard the truth about their tactics, and other residents had found their voices to speak up about their own problems. But as I drove home through the quiet neighborhood streets, I found myself wondering if tonight's victory would actually stick. Bureaucrats had short memories when it came to promises made under pressure. Real change would require more than one dramatic meeting and a room full of angry neighbors. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at my flag hanging motionless in the still night air. The porch light illuminated the red, white, and blue fabric, and I felt the same sense of pride I'd experienced every time I'd seen that flag overseas. Tonight had been satisfying, but it was just the beginning. Linda Thompson and her board had learned that they couldn't push around veterans without consequences. Now, I needed to make sure they remembered that lesson long enough for it to matter. I checked my mailbox the following Thursday out of habit more than expectation. Bills, advertisements, the usual suburban mail routine, but tucked between a credit card offer and a grocery store circular was something that made me pause: the official Meadowbrook Community Association newsletter. The thing was professionally printed on glossy paper with the HOA logo prominently displayed at the top. Linda Thompson's name appeared in the masthead as editor, along with the other board members who'd looked so uncomfortable at last week's meeting. I flipped through the pages while walking back to my house, scanning the typical community updates about landscaping schedules and pool hours. Then I found what I was looking for on page 3, buried between a reminder about trash pickup times and an announcement about the annual block party. The heading read, "Policy Updates and Clarifications," in small, unremarkable font that most people would probably skip right over. The relevant paragraph was brief and written in the kind of bureaucratic language designed to sound routine. Effective immediately, flagpole brackets and American flag displays are considered pre-approved exterior modifications that do not require prior HOA approval. Residents may install and maintain patriotic displays in accordance with federal guidelines for respectful flag presentation. I read it twice, then smiled. No mention of the meeting, no reference to federal law or veteran rights, no acknowledgement that they'd been completely wrong about their authority to regulate flag displays, just a quiet policy change that made it sound like they'd always been supportive of patriotic displays. Classic bureaucratic face-saving. They'd fixed the problem without admitting there had been a problem in the first place. I folded the newsletter and headed inside, but I couldn't shake the satisfaction of seeing those words in print. Pre-approved modifications, no prior approval required. Linda Thompson had essentially published her surrender in the community newsletter, even if she'd wrapped it in administrative language. The real test came over the next few days. Friday afternoon, I was working in my garage when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. I looked up to see Tom Bradley, a guy I knew from the neighborhood but had never talked to much beyond the occasional wave. He was probably in his 60s, with a kind of weathered face that suggested outdoor work, and he was carrying a small American flag still in its packaging. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by," Tom said, shifting the flag from one hand to the other. "I wanted to thank you for what you did at that meeting." I wiped my hands on a shop rag and walked over to meet him. Just stood up for what was right. "Well, it meant something to me," Tom said. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home in '71, been wanting to put up a flag for years, but after what happened to the Johnsons down on Elm Street a few years back, I figured it wasn't worth the hassle. That caught my attention. What happened to the Johnsons? Got hit with a violation for their flagpole. Ended up paying the fine and taking it down rather than fight it." Tom shook his head. "I should have said something then, but I didn't want the trouble. After hearing you speak up, though, I realized I was being a coward." I looked at the flag in his hands, still sealed in clear plastic. "You planning to put that up?" "This weekend," Tom said. "Got a bracket ordered online, should be here tomorrow. Figured if they want to fine me now, they can explain it to the newspaper." We talked for another 10 minutes about his service and the best way to mount a flag bracket on vinyl siding. Tom had been a helicopter mechanic in Vietnam, working on Hueys that brought wounded soldiers back from combat zones. He'd seen enough flag-draped stretchers to understand what the symbol meant, and he'd been quietly angry about the HOA's restrictions for years. Saturday morning brought another visitor. I was drinking coffee on my porch when a woman I didn't recognize walked up my driveway. She was probably in her 70s, moving carefully but with determination, carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Dorothy Chen from Birch Street. I brought you some cookies." I stood up and accepted the plate, which was still warm. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Chen. What's the occasion?" "I wanted to thank you for standing up to that HOA board," she said. "My husband served in Korea, came home in 1953. He passed away 2 years ago, and I've been wanting to put up a flag in his memory. But after all the stories about fines and violations, I was too scared to try." Dorothy had the same quiet dignity I'd seen in a lot of military spouses over the years. The kind of strength that came from decades of worrying about someone in uniform, then carrying their memory after they were gone. She told me about her husband's service as a combat medic, how he'd saved lives under fire and never talked about it until the very end of his own life. "I ordered a flag yesterday," she said. "It should arrive Monday. I know Harold would be proud to see it flying again." By Sunday evening, I could see Tom's flag from my front porch, hanging from a bracket mounted on his garage. Dorothy's hadn't arrived yet, but I'd watched her measuring her front porch columns, planning where to put the mounting hardware. 2 more flags in the neighborhood, because people finally felt safe to honor their service and their memories. Monday brought an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end introduced herself as Sarah Martinez from the local newspaper. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm calling about the incident with your HOA and the American flag display. Someone who attended the community meeting reached out to us, and we'd like to do a story about veterans' rights and homeowner association overreach. I leaned back in my kitchen chair considering the request. Part of me was tempted to tell the whole story to make sure Linda Thompson's mistake got the public attention it deserved. But another part of me, the part that had learned to be suspicious of media attention during my military career, urged caution. "What kind of story are you planning to write?" I asked. "We're interested in the broader issue of HOA policies that conflict with federal law," Sarah said. "Your situation seems like a perfect example of how veterans can be targeted for displaying patriotic symbols. We'd love to get your perspective on what happened and how you resolved it." I thought about Tom and Dorothy, about the other neighbors who'd shared their stories at the meeting, about all the people who'd paid fines over the years rather than fight back. The story was bigger than just my flag, and maybe it deserved to be told. But I also thought about the newsletter sitting on my counter, about the policy change that had quietly fixed the problem without admitting fault. Sometimes the best victories were the ones that didn't require public vindication. "I appreciate the interest," I told Sarah, "but I'm going to pass on the interview. Can I ask why?" This seems like exactly the kind of story that could help other veterans facing similar situations. "Because standing up for your rights shouldn't be newsworthy," I said. "It should just be normal. Sometimes you have to do what's necessary, but that doesn't mean you need to make a big production out of it." Sarah tried to convince me for another few minutes, explaining how the story could raise awareness and help other communities avoid similar problems. She wasn't wrong about the potential impact, but I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do. The policy had changed, neighbors felt safe to display their flags, and the HOA board had learned a lesson about federal law. Making it into a newspaper story would just embarrass Linda Thompson and the other board members without adding anything useful. They'd made a mistake, they'd fixed it, and now everyone could move on. I hung up the phone and walked out to my porch. The evening air was still and warm, and I could see Tom's flag hanging motionless in the distance. Dorothy's flag had arrived that afternoon, and I'd watched her carefully mounting the bracket on her porch column with the help of a neighbor. By tomorrow, there would be 3 flags visible from my front door. I sat down in my porch chair and looked at my own flag, the same one that had started this whole situation. It hung exactly where it had been a week ago, unchanged except for the company it now had in the neighborhood. 3 veterans' flags flying freely because one HOA board had learned they couldn't regulate patriotism. The satisfaction I felt wasn't about winning an argument or embarrassing bureaucrats. It was about Tom finally feeling safe to honor his Vietnam service, about Dorothy getting to display the flag her husband had fought for in Korea, about turning one association's overreach into a victory for everyone who'd been afraid to show their pride. Sometimes the best fights were the ones that ended quietly, with policy changes buried in newsletters and neighbors finding the courage to do what they'd always wanted to do. No newspaper stories required,